What's up guys, Asian here, and with the latest ESO PTS patch notes going out and the concern of the direction ZOS is taking the game, there's been a lot of discussion, particularly among the endgame community, as to leaving ESO permanently and transitioning to either a new MMO or just leaving ESO entirely and MMOs in general. One of the games that has been floated around as an alternative for those who are thinking about leaving ESO is Final Fantasy XIV. As a former endgame player of ESO and a current endgame player of Final Fantasy, I figured I would take this opportunity to kind of share my thoughts on the raiding scene in Final Fantasy and do a compare-contrast between ESO and Final Fantasy, their raiding scenes, and what to expect if you do decide to jump ship and come over to Final Fantasy. This video is going to be on the long side of things. There are many things I want to discuss about the raiding scene in Final Fantasy. I don't think a 10-minute long video is really going to do it justice, and I do want to be relatively thorough in kind of the true raiding experience in Final Fantasy and how it compares to ESO. So there will be timestamps down below for specific sections that I'm talking about in case you are particularly interested in one specific part of the raiding scene in Final Fantasy. So, with all that said, let's go ahead and get started here. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the difficulty tiers that you'll find in Final Fantasy. There are basically 4 different tiers of difficulty in Final Fantasy. The first is what I'd like to call casual level, or normal level is typically what it's called. These include things like dungeons, as you see here, as well as trials and raids. So raids and trials are all 8-man content, that is 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS, while dungeons are 4-man content, that's 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS. Normal content, generally speaking, is main storyline content. So for example, this trial, the Dancing Plague, is part of the Shadowbringers storyline. Raids are generally speaking side content that's done after you have completed the expansion main story. Dungeons, along the same vein, are typically main storyline or post-game content, or to say post-patch content. The next step up from normal content is called extreme content. These are only found in trials. So, for example, going back to the Dancing Plague, you have a normal version and an extreme version, and so on and so forth. Related to extreme is a difficulty called Unreal. Unreal is basically older content that has been scaled up to your current level. So, for example, Ultima's Bane is originally a level 50 content, but Ultima's Bane Unreal has been scaled to level 90 instead. But ultimately, an Unreal trial is the same thing as an extreme trial, it's just an older trial scaled up to the current level cap. Next to up above extreme are going to be what are called savage level content. These are only in the raids, and the current savage tier is going to be under the high-end duty. As you can see, based on the naming high-end duty versus regular duty, Final Fantasy developers view Savage as endgame content. And most people do consider Savage as an endgame, as the start of endgame content. And the final, most difficult tier in Final Fantasy are called the Ultimates. Currently there are 4 Ultimates in the game, and they're going to introduce a 5th one before the next expansion is released. Ultimates are particularly hard because you are forced to level sync down to the level on which the ultimate was released. So in this example, Unending Coil of Bahamut and the Weapon's Refrain, you are forced down to level 70, and you are also item level synced as well. So all of your item levels are brought down to the level that the ultimate is scaled to. On top of that, mechanics are very, very precise here, and basically it is a group effort to accomplish ultimates. Ultimate level content is considered the last tier of difficulty in PvE content in Final Fantasy, and it is a mark of a true high-end raider if you're able to complete Ultimates consistently. So one of the things you guys may have noticed when I was scrolling through all of those duties were that there were pretty much all of the names of the expansions were present on the duty finder. So you can see here into this first tab under dungeons we have 1 for each of the different expansions up until Endbringer. So we have the Realm Reborn, Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers. Down the second tab for dungeons, we have just the Endwalker dungeons. As you can kind of infer from this, this kind of means that the access to each of these dungeons and correspondingly trials as well as raids is tied to the main story progression. In Final Fantasy, we call it the MSQ. What this basically means is that in order to get to the current content, so in this case this would be Asphodelos, the first 4 floors, so first, second, third circles, and so on, you need to finish the Endwalker main storyline. And it's the same thing with all the other stuff. So let's say you wanted to do Eden's Gate, for example, you would have to do the Shadowbringers storyline. Now, in Shadowbringers, there is a bit of a caveat here. Typically speaking, with the MSQ, the expansion is the X.0 patch, so Shadowbringers, for example, would have been 5.0. For the last phase of the Eden's Promise, they actually had you complete up through 5.3, which is post-patch content. It's basically a major patch that introduces a little bit more MSQ to kind of tie in to the rest of the main story, basically help links the expansion stories together. We don't know if that's going to be the case for Endwalker, where we have to finish 6.3, for example, to get to the last set of floors, but that may or may not be the case. We're not 100% sure yet, but that Shadowbringers so far has been the only exception to that rule. Right now, all you have to do to get to the current content is to complete the current expansion. Now, in terms of how long the game is, if we go ahead and go look at New Game Plus, this is probably a rough approximation of how long each of these sections are right now. So A Realm Reborn, also known as the base game, this is going to be the longest section. Then we have Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and finally Endwalker. Endwalker obviously doesn't have all of its post-patch content yet, so that's why there's only 2 parts of Endwalker right now. We're still waiting on a few of the post-patch MSQ in order to get Part 3 and Part 4 respectively. Now, in terms of time taken, like I mentioned, A Realm Reborn is going to be the chunkiest part of your MSQ experience, and if you're familiar with playing Final Fantasy or JRPGs in general, that sort of makes sense. They have to build a world for you, they have to introduce you to all the different characters, they have to set up the story for you, and because this is a multi-expansion game, they also need to set the foundations for some of the later patches like Heavensward and Stormblood. So, Realm Reborn is going to be the chunkiest section. It's also the slowest and possibly the worst expansion coming in as a new player because you start off from level 1. So it's going to feel slow, combat's going to feel slow, the story's going to feel slow, but everything here is meant for a reason. It's to help set up the story for future expansions, to help introduce you to the world, and help introduce you to the lore behind what's going on. That being said, A Realm Reborn is notorious for being quite a bit of a slog, particularly once you get into the post-patch content. However, Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker, that's kind of where the writing team and the developers have really hit their stride in terms of pacing of the content, and so the rest of the expansions are relatively straightforward and relatively quick in comparison to A Realm Reborn. In terms of how much time you're going to be spending in each of these expansions, assuming that you just blow through all the dialogue and all the cutscenes, A Realm Reborn is probably going to take you around 50 hours, and each of the expansions is, in and of itself, sort of a Final Fantasy game in terms of main story duration. So if you're not at all listening to the story, A Realm Reborn is probably going to take you between 40 to 50 hours, and Heavensward and Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker, those are all going to take you probably between 20 to 30 hours if you're just blowing through all of the dialogue and cutscenes and skipping all of the optional content. So you're just blowing through the MSQ and you're ignoring everything else. So if you go ahead and do the math, that ends up being about 150 hours worth of MSQ. That's, again, if you just start blowing through all of the dialogue, all the cutscenes, and just focus on just getting through the main story as quickly as you possibly can. Now, a lot of Final Fantasy players will advise against doing it because that's the strength of Final Fantasy. It is a JRPG with a very strong storytelling basis. However, the story might not be best for everybody. If you don't like Final Fantasy, or if this is your first Final Fantasy, or maybe you don't like JRPGs in general, then you might want to just blow through all of the story stuff and just get straight to the endgame content. However, if you really do enjoy Final Fantasy as a series, if you enjoy JRPGs, or especially if this is your first Final Fantasy, I would recommend at the very least paying some attention to the story. If you had to skip any of these, I would probably say skip A Realm Reborn and start at Heavensward, just because A Realm Reborn is going to be a bit of a slog. Speaking of skips, you can purchase story skips and job skips. You will need to purchase both of them. Would be purchased off of the Mog Station, which is their real life cash shop. You would need to buy a story skip. There are multiple different versions. The most current one will get you all the way through to the start of Endwalker, but you would also need to buy what's called a job skip as well, because the main story progression and your job progressions are independent of each other. So if you get just the main story skip, it'll get you all the way up to Endwalker, the start of Endwalker. You still have to do the rest of Endwalker, but your jobs would not be leveled. So you would also need to get a job skip, which would get you all the way up to level 80, get you the appropriate gear for that level, and so on. So that, I believe both of them would cost combined about either $50 or $60. I don't remember if it's $25 or $30 for a skip. So you would be paying real money, plus you would still need to go through all of the Endwalker MSQ as well, and level your job from 80 to 90. So in my opinion, if you have the time to devote to just doing the main story, I would recommend just going through the main story. But if you just want to get to the end of raiding, the end game content, and you have the money to spare, go ahead and buy those skips. Just bear in mind that because you're skipping straight from level 1 to 80, you will need to kind of learn how to play your class. A lot of players in Final Fantasy kind of look down on people who buy job skips because, generally speaking, you won't have the same level of content experience as to how to play your class, especially if you're looking at playing a tank or a healer, because those two jobs are played very differently in Final Fantasy compared to ESO in particular, and your roles are very important in the overall success in group content. So my personal recommendation, if you had to skip, would just to skip A Realm Reborn, play through Heavensward all the way through to Endwalker, and also on the same line, you would also need to get a job skip as well. So you would get a job skip and then skip A Realm Reborn if you had to skip. Otherwise, I'd recommend just playing through the story. If you are dedicated and have the time, you can probably blow through all of it within 2 to 3 weeks. But that's really dependent on how much time you have. Like I mentioned earlier, it's going to take you about 150 hours to get through all of the main story, assuming you're skipping all the other optional content. Alright, so we talked about how to get to all of this content, but we never really talked about what each content sort of entails and how group content works in Final Fantasy. So dungeons in Final Fantasy are very similar to dungeons in ESO, where you have a certain number of bosses. In this case, all dungeons, except for some in ARR, have 3 bosses with trash in between. Dungeons are 4-man content, so 1 tank, 1 healer, 2 DPS, unless you decide to go in unsynced, in which case you can bring however many role compositions you would like, as long as it's still 4 people. Trials, on the other hand, these are all 8-man content, so if you're doing them synced, it's 2 tanks, 2 healers, and 4 DPS. Trials and raids are basically all a single boss in a single arena. There's no trash pulls, it's just you, the boss, the arena, and a timer. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that each of these different duties does have a time limit associated with it. So for example, these trials all have a time limit of 60 minutes, including the extreme versions of these trials. These all have time limits of 60 minutes. If you don't beat the boss in 60 minutes, you're kicked out of the instance. Same thing with the raids. In raids also have a time limit. This one's longer. It's 90 minutes for the first 3 floors, and for the 4th floor it's going to be 120 minutes on the Savage versions, 90 in the normal versions. Normal raids are very similar to trials in that it's 1 boss, 1 arena, and that's pretty much it. No trash pulls, nothing at all. Alliance raids, on the other hand, these are kind of a glorified dungeon, a more difficult dungeon, in that there are also bosses and trash in between. There's typically 4 bosses per Alliance raid, and then trash pulls in between each of those. Now, in terms of how they are all released, typically speaking, at the start of each expansion, you get 3 different trials. You get 2 MSQ trials, and you get the final MSQ trial. In terms of dungeons, each expansion will have 5 leveling dungeons. The exception is going to be ARR, because that's just 1 through 50. There's going to be a lot more dungeons than ARR. Plus, there's going to be 1 final MSQ dungeon, which is going to be at the level cap, so 6 MSQ dungeons total. And then you have a bunch of optional dungeons. Then for post-patch content, they typically will introduce a dungeon per patch. So patch cycle is 0.0 for the initial release, then 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. There will be a dungeon in each of those, and that's basically the dungeon release cycle. For trials, like I mentioned, you have three main story, so 2 in the progression, 1 at the end. And then you also have additional trials that are unlocked throughout the post-patch content. So typically speaking, at the 0.3 patch, so 5.3, 4.3, etc., you will get another trial, which is main story related. So in Shadowbringers, it's the Seed of Sacrifice. And on top of this, you also get what's called a trial series. This typically releases in the 0.2 version of the patch. So for Shadowbringers, this was the weapon series, the Ultimate Weapon series. Started with Cinder Drift in 5.2, followed by Castrum Marinum in 5.4, and then Cloud Deck in 5.5. Each of these will also have their extremes that are unlocked at separate points. So right off the gate at X.0, the expansion launch, you get the first two. You get the first 2 MSQ trials, you get the extreme versions of those. Then in X.1, you get the final MSQ extreme, so in this case this would be Hades Elegy. And then with all of the other trials in 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, you would get the extreme versions of all of these. In terms of raids, Alliance raids are released on the odd cycles, so X.1, X.3, X.5, because these are designed to be catch-up gear. They will drop gear that is designed for more casual players to catch up to the high-end players who are getting all their best-in-slot content, all their best-in-slot gear. And then the Savage raids are unlocked in groups of 4. So here we have Eden's Gate. You can see this is 4, and then Eden's Verse, another group of 4, and then Eden's Promise is the final 4. So there's 4 that are released at the same time, and these are released on even number patches. So the initial 4 are going to be released on X.0, so that'd be Eden's Gate. Eden's Verse was released on X.2, so 5.2, and then Eden's Promise was released in 5.4. This is where they increase the item cap, the item level for that expansion, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But that's pretty much how everything works here in terms of how content is released and what you can expect from them. One quick thing here, I did mention that Alliance Raids were glorified dungeons. They're a little bit more than that in the fact that it's actually a 24-man content, so you have 3 teams of 8 people, so that's still the 2 tanks, 2 healers, 4 DPS. So Alliance raids are much larger affairs, but don't worry, you're not competing against the other 23 people for loot. You're only competing against the 7 people in your group for most loot. There is global loot that is shared among all 24 players, but that's typically small things like minions, orchestrion rolls, things like that, of that nature. So now let's go ahead and talk about gear. So unlike in ESO, Final Fantasy follows a far more traditional vertical progression. So ESO follows what's called horizontal progression. That is, once you hit CP 160, your gear stops leveling. The higher your CP is, it doesn't really matter because your gear is always going to be scaled to CP 160, as is everything else. So where the variety comes in ESO in terms of horizontal progression is the set bonuses and the set effects. In Final Fantasy, each gear piece has an associated item level. So for example, this is my Astrologian. It's a healer. We have best in slot for healers for this particular build. You can see that each of these different armor pieces and weapons has an item level. Generally speaking, the higher the item level, the higher the stats conferred by that piece. So for example, here I have a 580 ring and I have a 600 ring. The 600 ring gives much more vitality and mind, which are the 2 primary stats for a healer. So vitality is health, mind just dictates how much healing and damage you're able to do. So 133 vitality, 142 mind versus 580, which gives me 117 vitality and 127 mind. So the higher the item level, the higher your stats are going to be. You can also see that there are what's called substats underneath, so there's 2 additional stats, in this case critical hit determination. This also has critical hit determination, but there are other substats as well, like spell speed and direct hit rate. So the substats do play a bit of a role in terms of your overall damage, and just because 2 pieces of armor might have the same item level, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same substats, and that might play a difference as to considering what is best in slot for your particular build. So for example, if we go over to, I believe my casters have this issue, where we have two different item level 600 gear. So we have this Augmented Radiance Visor of Casting, and we also have the Asphodelos Headgear of Casting, both of which are item level 600. However, you've noticed that they have different substats. So the Asphodelos Headgear has crit hit and direct hit rate, but the Augmented Radiant has Determination and Spell Speed. So for this particular summoner build, I'm running a spell speed build, so I want the additional spell speed. However, if I'm playing a red mage, which is also a caster, I want more crit because the way that the red mage works, you don't really want spell speed. So even though gear might have the same item level, there is a little bit of variety here and there based on how your subset distributions are set out depending on the specific gear piece. In addition, skill speed and spell speed plays a bit of a role when it comes to tanks and healers. So for example here, my Astrologian, we spec very heavily into spell speed as an Astrologian, so you can see I have overmelded this particular set to get me more spell speed substats, and generally speaking I'll be wearing jewelry that has spell speed associated with it. Compare that to something like a white mage, which is going to be more crit oriented and so won't have that spell speed. So you notice I have a different ring here that has item level 600 because I don't care too much about the additional spell speed on my white mage here. So despite the fact that it is vertical progression and generally speaking higher item level is going to be better gear, there is a little bit of build variety based on what your specific class is focused around. Generally speaking though, the build variety is really only going to be seen in the support roles with healers and tanks, as well as the caster classes, because there is more variety and a little bit more nuance in how you play your casters compared to the other DPS classes. So all the melee classes, for example, with the exception of Monk, typically will be running at 2.5 global cooldown, which is the minimum skill speed. Same thing with the range DPS, with the rare exception of the Dancer, because of the way that their buffs line up, you'll be sitting at around 2.5 skill speed. You won't really be speccing into skill speed at all. So for melee builds and physical range, typically it's just one build. For casters, there's a little bit more nuance there. So you do have a little bit of additional flexibility when it comes to builds, just because, like for example, Black Mage and Summoner, you can build for spell speed or you can build for crit. And then for tanks and healers, there are what are called skill speed and spell speed tiers. So for example, most tanks nowadays will be running around 2.4 to 2.41 global cooldown, so you have a lot of skill speed. And then healers can also run higher spell speed in some situations. Most healers, however, will only have 2 to 3 builds, a minimum spell speed, a minimum piety, and medium piety, but there are some flexibilities in terms of overall build variety in Final Fantasy. It's just not quite the same level as you would expect to see in a game with horizontal progression like ESO. But what about job balance? Here is a log, the statistics from the logs for the Asphodelos, which is the current Savage content, of all the different DPS classes here. So you will see that there are going to be classes that will be pulling ahead of other classes, even within the same sort of roles. So Ninja, Samurai, Monk, Dragoon, these are all melee classes, but you do see that they are relatively close together to each other. You can kind of see the same thing with the physical range, Bard, Machinist, and Dancer, they're all relatively close together. Summoner, Red Mage, Black Mage, there's a little bit more disparity here. If we take a look at the medians, you can see that the difference between DPS between the lowest and the highest is about 1k or so. In this case, it's about 800-ish DPS. Take a look at maxes, 9.6 versus 8.6. That is about 1k difference in total DPS. So, generally speaking, the job balance in Final Fantasy is actually really good. So again, taking a look at within your specific DPS role, so for melee DPS, Reaper, the median is 8.3 versus 8.6 for Ninja, so 300 DPS difference. If we take a look at the maximums, it's 9.2 versus again 9.6, so about a 400 DPS difference here. So within each role there is very good balance, and the reason why Dragoon and Reaper are lower is because they do provide some group utility as well. So for example, Dragoon provides group buffs for your damage. Reaper provides also a group buff as well as group mitigation and a group heal over time. Same thing sort of Red Mage and Summoner, both of these have group buffs. Red Mage has an additional group mitigation, and Range DPS also provide group mitigation as well. So the game is balanced around the more group utility you have as a job, the lower your personal DPS is going to be in order to help balance out the additional group utility. On top of that, tanks and healers are also expected to do your own version of DPS. So here are the tanks, for example. So the tanks DPS and heal DPS are obviously going to be lower than dedicated DPS, but it's still going to be relatively high compared to something like ESO in terms of overall damage percentage contribution. So Gunbreakers and Dark Knights, for example, they're neck and neck at 5.6, as are Paladins and Warriors at 5.3. Take a look at the medians here. And the same thing with healers here. Again, they're going to be lower compared to tanks, but you're still going to be very, very well balanced in terms of overall damage. 4.7 on the high end versus 4.5 on the low end for Astrologian. And again, these are all sort of balanced around how selfish a healer is. So White Mage doesn't really provide, White Mage and Sage don't really provide too much in terms of group buffs, but Scholar and Astrologian do have abilities that provide group damage buffs. So their personal DPS as a result is going to be lower. Astrologian is also in this weird spot where their overall damage number is going to be affected by how good your DPS are, just because of the way the class mechanic works. So there is, you are expected to DPS as a healer and a tank in Final Fantasy, and on top of that, your balance here is actually very, very good compared to ESO. You're not going to be penalized for bringing a quote-unquote low-tier DPS to a raid group. On top of that, there are some mechanics in Final Fantasy that do encourage you to bring different roles, particularly DPS. So I'm not in a party right now, so I can't really show you what this would look like. But you can see here that there is a party bonus. So there are 5 different roles in Final Fantasy: tank, healer, melee DPS, physical range DPS, and magic DPS. So if you have one of each role, you get a 5% bonus, 1% for each of the different roles, to your primary stats. So that's things like your health, your vitality, your intelligence, strength, dexterity, mind. That does make a little bit of a difference when it comes to your overall damage potential. So rather than stacking, for example, 2 Dark Knights and 2 White Mages and 4 Ninjas, for example, that'll only get you 3% to your overall main stats, compared to if you had included a physical range and a magic DPS, that would get you the full 5%. So there is a little bit of variety there that is encouraged to the party bonus. On top of that, there's also a mechanic called Limit Break, which you guys, again, don't see here because I'm not in a party and not in an instance. But limit breaks basically are a way to help boost your overall group DPS, and that is passively generated throughout the duration of a fight. This passive generation is slower if you have duplicate jobs. So that situation where you had 2 Dark Knights, 2 White Mages, and 4 Ninjas, those are only 3 unique jobs, so your limit break generation is going to be incredibly slow on that particular team, which does end up cutting into your group DPS. Compare that with a team that has 2 different tanks, 2 different healers, and 4 different DPS. With 8 unique jobs, you have the maximum passive generation, which will get you your LB3 faster, which again contributes to overall group DPS. So there are systems in place to help encourage diversity in the job that you bring to an overall raid group. And like I mentioned earlier, you're typically not going to get kicked out for bringing a low DPS job. Generally speaking, in Final Fantasy, it's more about how comfortable you are with your job and your rotation compared to how high does it hit on Final Fantasy logs. So there is that aspect as well. Finally, let's talk about job identity here. So job identity refers to how unique each job feels, compared to other jobs that use either the same gear or fall under the same role here. Final Fantasy, each job has what's called a job gauge. So I'm on the machinist right now, and you can see that I have a job gauge up here. This is my heat gauge as well as my battery gauge, both of which are used for different specific abilities here. So for example, my battery gauge dictates when I can use my automaton queen. My heat gauge, on the other hand, determines when I can use hypercharge, which is sort of like a burst window for machinist. Now, Machinist is a physical range, so let's jump to a different physical range. Let's jump, for example, to Bard. You can see that our job gauge has changed because Bards have a completely different set of mechanics. We have our song gauge, as well as our repertoire, our coda gauge here, and then we have our soul voice gauge down here below. Soul voice is used for Apex Arrow as well as Blast Arrow once we use it. This song gauge dictates how long we have for our songs. These coda are when we sing each of our different songs, and when we have 3 coda, we can use Radiant Finale for an additional group damage buff. So Bard plays very, very differently than Machinist. And if we jump to the final physical range dancer, we see again that our job gauge has changed. We have our timer here for our standard step buff here. We have our esprit gauge, and then we also have fans, which you won't see here because I'm not in combat and not doing anything right now, but there would be fans that come up which we used for fan dance 1 and 2. And then we also have our esprit, which we use for our saber dance. And then this is to help keep time for our standard step, which is our buff that we are able to provide for one other group member and ourselves. So even though all three of these are physical range DPS, because of their job gauges, they all feel unique and they all feel like their own unique jobs here. And same thing for all the different roles, jobs in the game. So Paladins, Gunbreaker, Warrior, Dark Knight, these are all tanks. So Paladin has its own gauge. Here we have our, what's it called here? Forget what it's called here. It's our oath gauge, so we have our oath gauge. So that's under Paladin. Gunbreakers have our cartridges. Warrior has our beast gauge, and Dark Knight has our dark side gauge as well as our blood gauge as well. So all of these are tanks, but because of our different job gauges, they all feel unique and they all play differently, even though they're all tanks. So job identity in Final Fantasy is very, very strong, despite the fact that a lot of people bash that, oh, all the classes just do the same 1-2-3 combo. Yes, they do, but they also feel unique because each job has its own unique job gauges that are used for their own unique job skills. Right, now that we've talked about gear and builds and job identity and things like that, let's talk about rotations, because that's going to be the next biggest change going from ESO to Final Fantasy. ESO has a very, very short global cooldown of about 1 second for each ability cast. Final Fantasy, the base global cooldown is 2.5 seconds, so more than twice as long, so it's going to feel slow. That being said, you have weaving involved in Final Fantasy as well. However, it is not light attack weaving, so in ESO, we light attack weave between our abilities. Here in Final Fantasy, we weave what are called off-global cooldowns between our global cooldown abilities. So this weaving is what we refer to in Final Fantasy. We also refer to it as double weaving for those jobs that have to weave 2 off-global cooldowns between our global cooldowns. Rotations in Final Fantasy are relatively fixed, and that's because you have fixed skills for each job. At the start of each patch, once people figure out exactly how each skills interact with each other, the new skills, their potencies, things like that, the math whizzes in Final Fantasy, the theory crafters in Final Fantasy, are able to figure out what the optimal rotation is going to be for a particular job. So rather than telling you about the rotation, I'll show you guys a rotation. Now I'm on my Gunbreaker. Keep in mind that Gunbreaker is one of the jobs that has very, very heavy weaving. Not all jobs do a lot of weaving. So for example, Bard is a job that might have a lot of weaving involved in certain aspects, but then you have stuff like Reaper, which doesn't really have as many off-global cooldowns to weave. So first of all, the global cooldown. This is the example of the global cooldown. You can see down there we have a recast timer of 2.4 seconds. That's because I have built some skill speed onto this particular Gunbreaker build. The base recast time is going to be 2.5 seconds. So that's your global cooldown. Now you'll also notice that this is called a weapon skill and has a recast time. No Mercy, on the other hand, is called an ability and has a longer recast time. This is what we call an off-global cooldown. Danger Zone is also an ability with a recast time. Gnashing Fang, on the other hand, is a weapon skill with a recast time. So all of these abilities are what are called off-global cooldowns, which we weave between our global cooldowns or our weapon skills or spells. So again, I'm just going to demonstrate what it looks like on a target dummy. So this is your opening rotation on a Gunbreaker at level 90. You can see here the global cooldown is global cooldowns are the abilities that have the circle going around their abilities here. The off-global cooldowns do not. So I messed up that opener a little bit here because I was trying to talk and do things at the same time here, but that's generally what a rotation will look like. Again, the abilities that have that sort of circular pattern going on, those are your weapon skills, those are your global cooldowns. Anything that does not have that circle is considered an off-global cooldown. Now, of course, those with long cooldowns, like for example, Blasting Zone, for example, that is an off-global cooldown, but it has a 30-second cooldown. So you can see that timer is going, but that's because it has a long cooldown. And each job does have its own rotation, so that's just a Gunbreaker. Warrior, on the other hand, can I change jobs? Second here. Warrior, on the other hand, has a different rotation, and that's just because it has different off-global cooldowns and different timers. Now, in terms of rotations and optimizing your rotations, that is going to be a little bit more fight specific. So in terms of optimizing your rotation, it's going to really be centered around what's called burst windows in Final Fantasy. Basically, group buffs are either on a 1-minute cooldown or a 2-minute cooldown, and so your burst window is going to be dependent on how well your group is able to line up those group buffs together. So if you start drifting your buffs, you're going to end up with lower group DPS because now your buffs are not all aligned together. On top of that, you also have potions, which are on a 4-minute 30-second cooldown. So if you just do the math, you're 30 seconds off with your potions cooldowns. So a lot of the optimization that comes in terms of optimizing your DPS and your rotation comes from when do I use my group buffs? Do I use them on the 2-minute cooldown, or is there a mechanic that's happening in the fight that would mean it's better off delaying our group buffs until the mechanic is over? And then when do I use my potions because I want to use it within our burst window? So there's a little bit of optimization that way in terms of rotation, but rotations are generally speaking relatively static for the most part for most DPS classes. There's not really a lot of dynamic play here, but in terms of weaving, there is some weaving, but it's not the same as ESO, and combat in general, to me at least, feels about as fast as it was in ESO, particularly when you take into consideration all the fight mechanics that are happening. So even though the global cooldown is slower, there's enough weaving going on, especially for some of the more busier jobs, as well as paying attention to the fight mechanics, that it still feels as busy as it is in ESO. The next thing I want to talk about is going to be looking for group, pugging, and general accessibility of endgame content in Final Fantasy compared to ESO. So in ESO, there really isn't a good way to pug groups for endgame content for vet trials, particularly the high-end stuff, like vet hard mode trials, for example. To get into those groups, you typically need to join a guild or join a raid group or something like that. In Final Fantasy, on the other hand, it's a little bit more, it's actually significantly more pug-friendly compared to ESO. Those are basically two different ways you can end up joining endgame content. The first is through Duty Finder or Raid Finder. So this is very similar to Dungeon Finder in ESO, where you select whatever duty you want it is to do, so for in this case the first circle, and you get matched up with anybody else who's also in Duty Finder looking for that specific duty. Now, in terms of NAEU data centers, this is not very often used to pug high-end content, if at all. It's far more common in the Japanese data centers to use the Duty Finder to find groups to do high-end content. But this is just one way that you can start pugging high-end content. The other way is through Party Finder, which is basically a manual dungeon finder, essentially. So here are all the high-end content, the current content in the game, as well as all the different ultimates. You can see here that all of these groups are looking for players, and a lot of them have players, and I can, if I wanted to, go into one and join a group, as long as there is a slot open for the job that I want. This is actually how a lot of players end up getting into endgame content in the first place. You go into Party Finder. Let's say I want to get into content. I'm this is my first time going into this particular instance. I see here that there's a practice group going on for the first circle, which is the first tier, the first floor, kind of the entry level into Savage, so to speak. So I'm like, okay, it's a learning party, it's practice. I'm going to go ahead and join this. And the way the Final Fantasy community works is it's very understanding. If you join a practice group, if you join a learning party, it's understood that you're not necessarily going to clear. You're just there to learn the fight. That's a really, really big plus, and that, in the result, makes it very easy to pug stuff in this game, pug high-end content. There are players in this game who have completed the entire Savage tier, so floors 1, 2, 3, and 4, all on the Party Finder. You don't need to be in a static, you don't need to be in a raid group in order to complete high-end content in this game. It is perfectly acceptable to jump into Party Finder and find Party Finder groups. Of course, this is still pugging, so you are going to have mixed results depending on, who's in the group, whether they're experienced, things like that. That being said, there are ways around it. Is go into recruitment criteria. Let's say I want to recruit for, not for PvP, let's say I want to recruit for the last circle. I have a couple of different options to me that will let me more fine-tune who I want to have here. So I can change the objective. I can change it to a practice group, where we're just practicing and there's no expectation of clearing. We can change it to a loot group, where we're farming for gear, or we can do duty completion, where our goal is to clear the content itself. We also have a beginner/first-timers welcome tag if we want to be particularly obvious that we are a practice group. We can do a completion status, so we can limit it to only people who have completed the duty. We can also force an average item level. So let's say we want to make sure that whoever is joining has good gear. We basically check this box and we can change this up to, let's say, 590, for example. We can also form a private party if we really wanted to be very exclusive. We can form a private party and introduce a party password if we wanted to. We can also use this comment section to write out what it is we're looking for. A practice group, for example, a blind progression, whatever strategies we're using, everything like that can all be put into Party Finder, which makes pugging endgame content in Final Fantasy very accessible. So overall, it is actually very easy to get into the endgame content here, very easy to get into Savage level content. A lot of players will recommend, if it's your first time doing harder content in Final Fantasy, to start with the extremes. Those are sort of the bridge between normal content and Savage level content, where the extremes have more difficult mechanics, but they are still relatively easy. The DPS check is typically going to be a lot more lenient than Savage level content, where difficulty does ramp up quite a bit here. So let's start talking about the mechanics you will see in Final Fantasy and how they compare to mechanics in ESO. Generally speaking, I personally think that mechanics in Final Fantasy tend to be more complex than those you see in ESO. On top of that, each fight has its own unique fight mechanics. So for example, if you were to take a look at P1S, the mechanics that you see in P1S are generally speaking going to be unique to that fight. Same thing with P2S, P3S, all the different fights in this game, they have unique mechanics based on the nature of the boss fight itself. So for example, P2S, you're fighting in the sewer against this sort of weird sewer monster amalgamation. The mechanics that are happening there all revolve around this sort of sewer system, the flow of water, things like that. P3S, on the other hand, you're fighting against a phoenix. So a lot of the mechanics there circle around fire, things like that. So the add phases, the fire thing, those types of mechanics there. That being said, just because the mechanics are all unique to a specific fight doesn't mean that there are repeats of specific mechanic types. So for example, there's always going to be a raid-wide, that's just a raid-wide damage dealing. There are going to be things like stack markers, where the group needs to stack together in order to share the damage. There are things like directional AoEs, for example, that push you in a certain direction that need to be resolved in a specific way. You will see these types of mechanics repeated throughout fights. So P1S, P2S, P3S, and P4S, those all have stack mechanics in them somewhere in one of the mechanics. So at some point in the fight, you need to group together in order to soak damage. The difference comes into how these stack mechanics are put together. So for example, P1S, the stack mechanic comes as part of a tank buster. The tank takes a big hit, and then the group stacks to take the second half of the tank buster hit. In P2S, on the other hand, you have two separate stack markers for healer stacks, so the stack markers are always going to go on the healers, so you need to split up into two groups in order to share that damage. On top of that, there's also going to be a knockback that's happening, so you need to make sure that you're hitting your knockback immunity or put yourself in a place where you'll be knocked back into the stack. P3S, the stack marker there, is instead of grouping up all as a group, either in healer stacks of 4 people or as a group with 8 people, you actually have to group together with a partner instead. So that would be you as a support, for example, are paired with a DPS, and you have a specific spot you go to in order to soak that particular stack. And there's a second stack in P3S, which is actually a light party stack, so you have 4 people stacks as well. So all these different mechanics are all stack mechanics, but they're implemented in different ways depending on the fight, which I think it really speaks to how creative the combat developers in Final Fantasy are compared to ESO. ESO mechanics, I feel, while they have gotten a little bit more complex, generally speaking, it more or less is the same, where it's a lot of don't stand in red or soak the damage or something like that. Now, not to say that there aren't unique mechanics in ESO. For example, Cloud Rest has unique mechanics that you don't see in, for example, Vet Asylum. But I feel like Final Fantasy has much more variety in its fights and how they utilize the same mechanic in different ways. On top of all these different mechanics, there is also DPS checks and heal checks in Final Fantasy fights that you don't really see so much in ESO. Now, when I say DPS checks and heal checks, I'm not talking about soft DPS checks like a soft enrage or anything like that, where things just get more difficult. I'm talking about hard DPS checks, in that if you don't heal everybody up to full, for example, everybody dies. Or if you don't meet the DPS check, if you don't meet the group DPS check, the group wipes, period. You see a lot of those in high-end content. All the extremes and all the savages have a hard DPS check. So if you don't meet the DPS check for a particular trial or a particular raid, the boss says, you know what, I'm done with you, I'm just going to kill everybody. So for example, P4S, Phase 1 has a DPS check, group DPS check of 48k, roughly speaking, and Phase 2 has a group DPS check of about roughly 49k. These don't really exist in ESO. ESO has more softer DPS checks, where the longer the fight goes, the harder it is. It's just the way the fights work. The longer a fight goes, the more chances there are for mistakes to happen, the harder it is to recover, things like that. Versus Final Fantasy, where it's very, very hard DPS checks. Now, some of the DPS checks are very lenient. So, for example, the current Endwalker Extreme Trial, Endsinger, for example, that has very, very lenient DPS check for an Extreme Trial. Other DPS checks are a lot tighter. So, for example, P4S is going to be very, very tight if you're running it week 1 or week 2. So that's sort of an additional complexity on top of already existing complex mechanics as well. So not only do you have to do all these mechanics that are happening back to back, but you also need to keep in mind you have to do your rotation right and meet the DPS check. Speaking of mechanics and the overall fight itself, Final Fantasy differs compared to ESO in that ESO has sort of a quasi-random mechanics that happen. Some of the mechanics that happen in ESO are based off of health percentages, but other mechanics in ESO just sort of happen randomly and are on a timer, and there is some RNG involved in that timer. So for example, Vet Asylum, the Steam Breath is Storm to Heavens, I should say, supposed to go off at least 35 seconds, but based on what mechanics are happening that OHMS is doing, that might be delayed up to 45 seconds, possibly 50 seconds. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, all the mechanics and all the fights in the game follow a timeline. So all the extreme fights, all of the savage fights, they all follow a specific timeline. So let's say at minute 1 into the fight, the boss will do this particular mechanic. At minute 2, the boss will do this second set of mechanics. So on and so forth. There are a couple of mechanics in Final Fantasy that are health based. So for example, one of the fights, what's the fight I'm thinking of? I'm blanking on the fight that I'm thinking. Oh, I remember what fight I'm thinking of. One of the Stormblood Extreme Trials, the transition from Phase 1 to Phase 2 is health dependent, so you need to meet that health threshold before you can get to the second phase. Each fight, therefore, sort of follows a very predictable pattern, which makes it actually very easy for people to come up with strategies. In fact, by the end of week 1, there will be a timeline out for the current Savage tier. I believe that was the case for this particular tier, where by the end of, I think, the second or third day, people had figured out the timelines for the fights and had already made spreadsheets as to here's the mechanic that happens and here's the time at which it happens. That makes it a lot easier for groups to kind of coordinate when do we want to use certain group mitigations, when do we want to use our group buffs, do we want to save our group buffs because this mechanic is happening at the 2-minute mark, for example, and so on and so forth. So while the fights in Final Fantasy are predictable, I think that it also lends to how, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think it's just a difference in how ESO versus Final Fantasy rating is approached. The predictability of the timeline in Final Fantasy allows you to really master content, because once you know the fight, you can just be like, okay, I know this mechanic's going to happen next because you just did this mechanic, so I know what to do there. I know which spot I have to go to for this particular mechanic because it's going to happen soon. I know when mitigation needs to be used because we worked that out beforehand, be based on the timeline. Versus ESO, which is a little bit more random. There is some structure to the mechanics, but it is definitely more random than Final Fantasy. Now, I realize I have talked up a lot of the Final Fantasy benefits of rating, or the positives of rating that I see in Final Fantasy, but there are also some downsides to Final Fantasy, including one big pain point, which I think may make or break some people here. Let's talk about that pain point. It is the weekly lockout. So for current tier content, so that is, in this particular example, it would be the first Savage tier. When 6.2 releases, it's going to be the next Savage tier. You are locked to one roll per floor per week while it is current. As of right now, in this patch, that cap has been lifted, so it is no longer weekly limited. But while it is current, it is considered weekly limited. So, for example, let's say you are doing the Savage tier and you do the first floor. You clear it. Everybody else in the group is also their first clear of the week. Great, you get your full rewards. You get 2 chests, and they both drop 2 to 1 items. So you get 3 things, you're able to roll on the loot, you roll on all of them, you get everything there. Great. You want to run it again? You certainly can. However, you will not be able to roll for loot. You've already rolled your loot for the week. So regardless of whether you have got everything that you rolled on or you got nothing, you are not able to get any more rewards from that particular floor at any given time. At least for that week. You have to wait until the week resets, which is Tuesday, late mornings, for those of you guys who live in America at least, in order to get your next chance to roll for loot. That's just one pain point. The second pain point is, let's say you want to do the 3rd floor because the 3rd floor drops the pants that you need, the leg armor that you need for your best in slot build. You want to join the 3rd floor? Well, unfortunately, you can't. Not unless you clear the 1st floor and the 2nd floor first. So you need to clear each floor sequentially. So let's say, again, you want to do P3S, you got to do P1S and P2S. Now there is a way around it, and that is joining the party finder for P3S specifically. However, if you choose to do that, you end up forfeiting your loot from P1S and P2S as well. So basically, by skipping up to the next floor, you end up giving up loot from the prior floors. And the game is very apparent when you just try to do that. So that is one of the biggest pain points that I have seen from people who have come from ESO to Final Fantasy, this weekly gear lockout, where you can only roll for loot once per week per floor. That pretty much limits, it basically time gates you in terms of getting your best in slot. So if you're lucky and you win every single roll, in theory you could get best in slot on the first week if you are incredibly lucky and get everything on the first roll and you get all the pieces that you need, and none of the pieces are tombstone gear, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But more commonly, it'll take you between 4 to 8 weeks, depending on how lucky you are with your rolls and how your particular raid group ends up divvying up the rewards. This is particularly painful. This particular point here, the weekly lockout, is particularly painful for those of you without a raid group, because now you're competing against pugs, not all of whom will be passing on everything, compared to a raid group where, typically speaking, there's going to be some sort of priority as to who get what drops first. So for example, you might say rings and earrings go to DPS first, while necklace and bracelet goes to supports first, and then when everybody gets what they need, you swap it around. Nobody rolls need or greed on anything until everybody gets what they need for their best in slot for the job that they're running for that particular tier. That is beneficial because at the very least you know, okay, I'm guaranteed to get it at some point. There is also a consolation prize for anybody who clears a floor. You do get a token that you can exchange for gear once you have enough. So for example, if you want jewelry pieces, yes, from the first floor, you need 4 tokens from the first floor, so 4 weeks minimum in order to get 1 jewelry piece. That's if you get really unlucky and don't get anything at all for 4 weeks. So at the very least, you're still guaranteed an armor piece. It just takes you quite a bit of time to get it. The other weekly lockout that matters for endgame players is the weekly tombstone cap. So there is a currency in Final Fantasy called tombstones, and this changes, the exact name changes depending on the specific patch that you're in. The very high-end tombstones, you are weekly capped to earning 450 a week. There is also a secondary endgame tombstone, but that is for lower item level gear, so it's not really as relevant unless you're a crafter. And then there's the low end tombstones, which you can get whenever, and that's just to get lower prior tombstone gear. So this 450 tombstone cap. All builds in Final Fantasy use some combination of Savage level gear, which is 600, 630, 660, the highest level armor, and Tombstone gear, which is also that same item level. So the current Tombstone gear for this patch is also item level 600. So you're capped at 450 tombstones, and when you use those tombstones to buy gear, you get the 10 item levels lower. So for this particular patch, the tombstone gear, if you buy it using tombstones, you will get it at item level 590. You need an upgrade material, which is a drop from Savage, or once the odd number patches are released, also gained from tokens from doing the alliance raids. Once you get that upgrade match, you can then upgrade it up to the maximum level, which is item level 600. So the price of the tombstone gear is fairly high overall. So again, you're capped at 450. That's enough to get you 1 jewelry piece. The jewelry piece, I believe, is 375 tombstones. But armor pieces are more than the 450. So I believe head, hands, and feet are 495, with chest and legs being 810 tombstones. So you need a minimum of 2 weeks tombstones in order to get a armor piece for your build. And that's before you have to consider you also need to get the upgrade material from either running the Savage or running the Alliance Raid. The Alliance Raid token, by the way, is also weekly capped. You're only able to get 1 token per week. So that is the biggest gripe that most people have. The rationale behind it is obviously to time gate people so you don't blow through all the content, get your best in slot gear, and then peace out until the next tier is released. I understand why they're doing it, is to help promote longevity of the game, but it still doesn't take away from the pain of being like, oh, I'm still not best in slot and this is 8 weeks into the patch. That is one of the big pain points. The other big pain points, and this might actually be a major one for ESO players specifically, is third-party support. Officially, by terms of service for Final Fantasy, you are not able to use third-party apps. So things like Raid Notifier, things like Code's Comment Alert, even UI add-ons are considered third-party, and you will be banned if you advertise that you are using them in in-game chat. Now, all that being said, the developers for Final Fantasy have come out and said, as long as we don't know anything about it, we won't do anything about it. So it's an untold practice that we do not talk about in-game third-party modifiers, third-party mods, third-party add-ons in-game. We can talk about them off-game. I can guarantee you there are Discord servers for a lot of third-party mods that are out there, but we don't talk about them in-game at all. And that's partially because they want to avoid a toxic environment where people are using parse add-ons to harass low parsing players, which is understandable, but it is still a big pain point there and a very, very different feeling compared to ESO, where third-party add-ons are embraced by the developers, at least for PC. So there are several third-party add-ons that are commonly used by raiders, the big one being ACT, Advanced Combat Tracker, I think it's called, which ends up doing, vlogs. So vlogs are a thing also in Final Fantasy as well. You have Cactbot, which is probably the closest equivalent you would get to something like Code's Combat Alerts. And there are obviously UI modifiers, UI mods. There are obviously gear mods you can put in. There are mods for Final Fantasy XIV out there. You just don't want to talk about using them in-game at all. If you do end up using them and you do get caught using them, either by talking about them in game or somebody decides to rat you out because you're streaming or something, then you could end up getting banned. Although the devs are, they traditionally have been a little bit more relaxed about things. They were getting a little bit uptight more recently, but generally speaking, they're pretty much a don't ask, don't tell, and we won't do anything sort of environment here in terms of third-party add-ons. Now, the final thing I want to touch upon are the rewards that you get for completing hard content. So it's widely regarded in the endgame community in ESO that the rewards for completing hard content are, generally speaking, lackluster. Yes, you get a title and you might get a skin or something, but the skins and mounts in ESO are generally considered to be pretty bad and not very unique overall. They're typically just reskins of prior mounts. In Final Fantasy, on the other hand, you do get mounts and you do get titles. I think you get titles, not for everything, but for some things you do get titles for completing hard level content. But more specifically, you get mounts. So for each of the, when you complete the tier for a particular trial, a raid I should say. So for example, this mount that I'm on, called Demi Phoenix, comes from completing Asphodel's the 4th Circle. Now you do have to roll on it, so if you're in a raid group, you might need to clear it 8 times in order to get your mount, but you do end up getting a mount for completing this, and it is unique. There is no other mount in the game that looks like this. On top of that, you obviously hear the music in the background. That is the unique mount music, so whenever you have the mount out, you will be playing this music, unless of course you have mount music off. And again, each of these mounts are unique. So let's say, I believe I also have Eden's Verse Refulgence. I have this mount here. If we go over to our mount guide, that is Ramu. So again, completely unique mount, completely unique music as well. So very unique mounts for rewards for completing Savage level content. On top of all of this, there are also mounts that you get for completing the extreme trials as well. So each of these extreme trials here, let's go to Stormblood because I have all the Stormblood extreme mounts here. Each of these extreme trials, all 7 of them, or in this case all 8 because they did include the Great Hunt Extreme here, all 8 of these trials do have mounts associated with them. So if you complete Pool of Tribute, you can roll on a mount if it drops. Or once you collect enough totems, because again you get a constellation prize where you get 1 totem when you clear the extreme trial, you can trade in 99 of these in order to get the amount. So you can either run the trial enough to get enough totems to trade for the amount, so you're guaranteed to get one after 99 runs, or you can get lucky and roll on it when it drops. And then once you get these mounts, you're able to basically combine all of them, so to speak, into one big amount. So I'm not going to jump on it right now, but the Euphonious Kamui comes from one of the Stormblood extreme trials. I believe this comes from Sazuku's extreme. But then when you have all 7 of these, you end up getting the Kamui of the 9 Tails. So again, another unique mount. Now, unfortunately, all of the extreme trial mounts for one expansion are all the same. So you can see these are all from the Heavensward extreme trials. They're all just recolors of the same mount. They all do have unique mount music because they do use music from that particular extreme fight. But unfortunately, they're all skinned the same. The only unique mount is going to be from when you collect all of them. So, for example, for Heavensward, you get the Firebird. For Realm Reborn, you get Kieran. And then for Stormblood, you get Kamui of the 9 Tails. I don't have the Shadowbringers mount yet. I'm still working on that one there. But there are a lot of mounts in this game, and you can achieve a lot of these just by doing hard content. So extreme content, for example. The Amaro mount is, you get this when you level all your jobs up to 80. The Rathlos mount comes from the Great Hunt Extreme. The Fey Gwibber comes from one of the Shadowbringers extreme trials. So a lot of these mounts do require you to do hard content in order to get, and it is quite the achievement. On top of this, I am in Fatal Strider right now, so I can actually, I don't have these weapons myself, but I can show you guys what they look like. But on top of this, you can also get Totem Gear Alexander. When you complete the ultimate, you get a totem. So these are going to be for completing Alexander Ultimate, so T. You get a unique weapon. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Dark Knight weapon here. So Dark Knight weapons do have particle effects on them. So these are all the unique ultimate weapons. So this is for the Dark Knight. You can see here, this is what you would get when you complete the ultimate trial. On top of you also get a title as well, so you do get something to flaunt that you have completed this. On top of this, because of the way the glamour system works, you are able to glam this on top of an existing weapon, so it's not like you have to use this weapon in order to see it. You can actually glam this on top of your existing weapon as well. So yeah, there you get some pretty cool stuff for beating endgame content in Final Fantasy. But yeah, that pretty much covers it for everything I wanted to talk about in terms of the differences between raiding in Final Fantasy versus ESO. Hopefully you guys enjoyed and have learned something. If you guys are intending on coming over to Final Fantasy, I hope to see you here. But otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys